Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and welcome to a new sort of special video that I'm going to be doing. Now, if you are new here, I do reviews of both music and movies along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I'd appreciate it if you gave this video a like and subscribe to my channel for future content. So today we are going to be focusing on movies as opposed to music, but this is going to be a bit of a special episode of movie content. Now, typically when I'm talking about movies in shorter form, I do it in a series that I call the Critical Corner, which has been going on in greater form on this channel as of late, but this is not an episode of the Critical Corner. I am going to be talking about several movies in this, but it is actually going to be a movie series, and you've probably already seen the title if you've clicked on this video. That's probably why you're interested in watching it. But I am going to be talking about the Netflix Fear Street Trilogy. Now, for those of you who do not know what the Fear Street Trilogy is, it is directed by a woman named Leigh Janiak. She directs all three of the movies. Sorry if I said that name wrong, by the way. But all three movies take place within this world known as Shadyside, where all these seemingly horrible circumstances are always happening. It seems like Shadyside is doomed to have bad luck for their whole life. There are always serial killers on the loose, and there's this other place called Sunnyside that always seems to be super lucky and not have any of that happen. So I'm going to be talking about the three movies in detail, and all of them connect to this idea of Sarah Fear, this witch, and trying to figure out the mystery of who this person is, as well as trying to stop the curses of Shadyside in different ways. So, let's go ahead and get started with the first Fear Street movie. I will also be ranking these movies at the end of this video, ranking them from my favorite to my least favorite. I know it's only three movies, but I still thought that'd be interesting to do. But let's go ahead and start with part 1, which is 1994. Alright, so part 1, 1994 of the Fear Street trilogy is essentially about this group of teenagers who are encountering the dark forces that have essentially been responsible for the murders going on in Shadyside since pretty much nearly the beginning of time, at least since back in 1666, according to this movie trilogy. And we follow a small group of teenagers, but the main two we do follow along with are Dina Johnson and Samantha Fraser, who are a couple in this series. And Samantha seems to be getting possessed by Sarah Fear, or at least by Sarah Fear's memories, and this causes a lot of things to happen, including serial killers going after this group of teenagers, and they have to figure out how to stop them. The Fear Street trilogy has gotten really popular on Netflix, and according to another reviewer that I watch, these movies were actually going to be released to theaters, but I think it was actually a pretty smart idea to release them onto Netflix. The Netflix formula works perfectly for movies like these, where you're able to anticipate each part, and honestly, for me, these movies do not really feel like they belonged in the theater. I think streaming service was a perfect place for them. That isn't necessarily a knock against their quality, but at the same time, I don't really love these movies as much as some people do. Now, don't get me wrong, I do understand the hype behind these movies, and I understand why they're so loved. There's a lot of lore behind them, a lot of mysteries to uncover. It's very trendy for what we are right now. We love movies where there is a lot of lore and a lot of mystery, and where you can sort of watch them in parts on a streaming service very quickly. Now, as far as 1994 went, I did enjoy myself while I was watching it, but after I finished it, I did definitely have some issues with it. Let's go ahead and talk about what I liked first. One of the things I did enjoy as someone who was born in the 90s was the 90s nostalgia. It was fun to see all that stuff pop up. Now, admittedly, to me, nostalgia does not make for a good movie. Just because there's interesting nostalgia popping up doesn't mean the movie's quality is better. In fact, sometimes the movie is trying to manipulate you by using nostalgia to make you feel a certain way. But this movie does it decently well, and I don't think it's super manipulative. There are some music choices in here that I think are a little obvious or just a little eye-roll worthy. Like, I love Creep by Radiohead, but I think that is a very obvious choice for a movie like this. I also do think, and this will be the case across the board for all three of the Fear Street movies, that the lore surrounding this series is pretty interesting. It's sort of fun to think that there's a world like Shadyside where they're cursed to always have serial killers coming around. They're essentially like a place where horrific events always happen. And of course, if you don't know this, the Fear Street trilogy is based on a book series by R.L. Stine. Now, I have never read the book series, but from what I understand, the Fear Street trilogy was more meant for teenagers, whereas the Goosebumps by R.L. Stine were more meant for children. So these movies are more meant to appeal to teenagers, although the fact that they're rated R is a little confusing to me. I think that teenagers, older teenagers, are probably the primary audience for these series. I mean, you can sort of tell in the way they're doing these horror settings, they're sort of modernizing them in the way, but also trying to keep it within the time period. Like, the way they interpret the 90s in this movie, for an example, does feel like it has an updated modern take, and some of the commentary it has, I don't necessarily consider that a negative thing in this one. It works a little more, but as we go into past time periods, I do think it starts to become more of a problem, which I'll talk about later. Also, what I do enjoy in this movie is the ending moments of it. I really think this movie picks up in the second half. There are some definite moments in this movie where it's just sort of dull to me and takes a while to pick up, but I really like what the second half does. It does some really creative things with serial killers and the types of killers that appear in this Fear Street world, but it does it in a very interesting and fun way, and the little twist it does with the serial killers was something that I thought was pretty fun. It doesn't necessarily make for the most scary thing in the world, but the concept, the thought of it is sort of interesting, and I think they did a good job having fun with it. Unfortunately, probably the biggest problem I had with this movie was the characters. I felt like all the main characters were not super interesting. Not that I disliked them necessarily, but I thought they were a little flat. The only exception I would give for this is Samantha Fraser. I thought she was a pretty fun character, and I feel like maybe she should have been the main character, as she was the one experiencing all these connections to Sarah Fear and having the visions about this witch from 1666 that is the cause for the curses. I think she has the most interesting stuff going on in the movie, but instead the movie focuses on Dita Johnson. Now, Kiana Madeira, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right once again, is not necessarily horrible in this role, but I just didn't find her super interesting. I feel like that may have been in part to the way the character was written. I just didn't care for her a whole lot. I didn't find her journey to be super compelling. The only thing I really liked in regards to her character was her relationship with Sam, which I thought was sort of sweet. I will say that I enjoyed Benjamin Flores Jr. as Josh, who played Dina's brother. I think he was a pretty fun character. He reminded me a lot of characters from Stranger Things, specifically Dustin. I feel like he could fit so smoothly into the Stranger Things world, almost unsettlingly so with how his character acts, which I don't necessarily say as an insult, but that does bring me to another point that I do feel like Fear Street 1994, more than any of the other movies, was partly influenced by the Stranger Things stuff, because it is about all these kids coming together to fight against a main evil. This one feels more Stranger Things influenced than any of the others. Overall, Fear Street 1994 is a mediocre movie. I feel like it could have really gotten a lot better if it had stayed with the energy it had in the second half, especially the ending half of the movie. One problem that is going to be prevalent across all three of these movies is that they're not really that scary, and I feel like this one is the least scary out of all the three. Now, the sense of fun it has, I think it can't be denied, especially, like I say, over and over again in the second half of the movie, but the fact that it's not very scary is a little bit of a detriment in my opinion, and with an R rating I really feel like they could have upped up the scares. But at the same time, I know they're trying to downplay it for teenagers. Still, I feel like they could have taken advantage of it and made it a little more creepy, because there are some PG-13 horror movies out there that are scarier than this R-rated one. So with that, I am going to give this movie a 3 out of 5 stars. It's not bad, but it's not great. Now let's go ahead and move on to the second Fear Street movie. So, the second part of Fear Street takes place in 1978, and if 1994 was inspired by the likes of Scream and Stranger Things, then I feel like 1978 is influenced by other classic slasher movies like Friday the 13th or Halloween, although Friday the 13th is clearly the influence here more than anything else. It takes place at a camp. It takes place apparently on a set that was used for a previous movie in which Jason was in that movie. I'm not sure what one it was, but I did read that. And yeah, it just has a lot of that feel of a Friday the 13th movie. Now, the fact that that is the case would make me think that I wouldn't enjoy this movie as much as the others in the series, because I'm actually not a huge fan of Friday the 13th. I know that's probably a controversial opinion, but I've never found that movie to be super compelling in the horror world. It's not horrible or anything, it's just not my favorite. But in fact, 1978 actually turned out to be a really solid movie, I thought. I really enjoyed this one. And speaking of what I've said about Fear Street 1994 feeling like Stranger Things, we actually do have a Stranger Things actor in 1978, Sadie Sink as the main character Ziggy, who is called a witch commonly in the movie. Of course, this witch terminology is sort of used in jest by the other characters because they're bullying her, but at the same time, similar to Sam in Fear Street Part 1, we do see that she eventually connects with Sarah Fear, the titular witch in the movies, in some way, shape, or form, so the fact that they're using witch is sort of ironic in that way. And I will say right off the bat, the strongest thing about this movie is probably Sadie Sink herself as Ziggy. I've always thought that she was one of the strongest elements of Stranger Things, even though I didn't love Season 2 as much as Season 1 of Stranger Things. I really think Sadie Sink brought a lot of talent to that show, and is definitely one of the best of the main cast in that series, I feel like. And she does a great job here as well, bringing a lot of fun to this character, a lot of emotion. I think she does a great job at making this character very complex, where you see that she has a lot of built-up anger inside of her, but you see why there's that anger there, especially in her very interesting relationship with her sister, Cindy Berman, who is played by Emily Rudd, who is also great in this movie. These two create a really good pair and a really good contrast of emotion. But to have the movie sort of overturn some of the cliches we've come to expect with this character, that is probably the biggest strength of the Fear Street movies in general. They do take typical horror tropes and they try to upend them in interesting ways. For an example, having a gay relationship in the first movie, which is not something you typically see, at least at the forefront of a horror movie. And in this one, taking a lot of horror tropes and sort of making them a little more interesting. Now, like the first movie, we do have a shady sider becoming a serial killer. This time, a teenager named Tommy Slater, played by McCabe Sly, sort of a clever homage to Friday the 13th because Tommy is the name of a very important character in the Jason lore, so that was sort of a fun thing that happened. And he sort of becomes a serial killer and seems to become possessed. It seems like he can't control his actions, and he starts going on a killing rampage, and we eventually come to realize that he is actually a character that appears in Part 1, although how he appears in Part 1 I don't necessarily want to reveal. And I think the fact that this movie focuses on just this really central conflict of the serial killer going after all these shady siders, and only the shady siders, not the sunny siders, and Ziggy and Cindy having to figure out how to stop it or what's going on. I think those two main focuses make this movie a lot more interesting than the first one. I think it makes it a much more character-driven thing, whereas the first one was more plot-driven with some uninteresting, mostly characters driving the plot. Now, like I said about Part 1, I do feel like these movies take the periods that they're in and create a sort of modern flair to help them connect with the Generation Z, who I feel like these movies are most meant for, but at the same time, it does still feel distinctly 80s in a lot of ways. I really enjoy the camp setting. I think the characters are a lot of fun and really lift this movie up, and I think for that reason it's pretty strong. It has a really good plot, and I think it's the most interesting of the series in my opinion, and the way it presents its plot. And I think it works really well as a standalone movie too, even though there are obviously things that connect it to Part 1 and Part 3. I think that it works pretty well as a standalone movie in some ways because of its plot taking place mainly in one universe, and most part, it actually just sort of stands well on its own. For that reason, I'm going to give this one a strong 3.5 out of 5 stars. Probably one of my favorite movies of the year so far. And finally, we have Fear Street Part 3, 1666. And this one goes all the way back to, of course, the 1660s, where we finally get to see Sarah Fear. But Sarah Fear is being possessed, sort of, or I guess Seraphir is possessing Dina. We see this happening at the end of part 2. Dina touches a skeleton hand of Seraphir in Seraphir's burial site, and she sort of gets transported back to the 1660s, and she sees her friends there too. We see that Dina has been sort of possessed by Seraphir, or we're seeing Seraphir through the perspective of Dina and how she sort of came to be known as the witch that has cursed Shadyside. And of course, like with the other 2 movies, they do upend certain tropes here, especially with Seraphir. There's a lot more revealed about Sarah, and of course there's more than meets the eye. It's a lot more complicated than just Seraphir cursed the town. And in fact, we learn how that is potentially not even the case at all. But I don't want to reveal that once again for fear of spoiling the movies for you all. So, this movie, there is one thing that I sort of have to spoil. It's divided into 2 halves, and if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. The first half is taking place in 1666. The second half is taking place in 1994. Now, I think this is sort of problematic because we spend the least amount of time in 1666, when in all honesty, I think this is probably the most interesting world out of all 3 of the movies. Now, I in part say that because I am biased to period pieces, and I think it's sort of fun to have horror movies set in these time periods. I think it makes for a more creepy atmosphere sometimes. I've seen a lot of people comparing this movie to The Witch, and aesthetically, I definitely agree. It looks a lot like The Witch, but plot-wise, it reminds me a lot more of The Crucible in it, talking about accusations and the town going hysterical and becoming all crazy and people burning people at the stake for witchcraft. So it is interesting in that regard that it's combining those 2 different types of movies. And for that reason, I do think the first half of this movie is far more interesting. It is a very fast-moving plot, and I think it has to be since it's only half of the movie, but that does make the action a lot more kinetic, a lot more fun. Now, probably the biggest problem of at least the first half of this 3rd movie is that, I once again have to repeat this, and this is probably where it's the biggest problem, is that they're trying to modernize certain things to appeal to the younger teenage audience. And because of that, I don't feel like some of the things the characters say and do in this movie would necessarily be reminiscent of the 1660s. Now, I'm not expecting this movie to be, like, incredibly historically accurate or whatever, and I don't even think that was necessarily the purpose of these movies. I think they cared a lot more about attributing to these different time periods and these different types of horror genres. But at the same time, it does create a little bit of a suspension of disbelief that you have to make, which is a little harder to do, I feel like, especially when these characters' accents are not very good. And I feel like that goes across the board for all the actors here. When we do transport to part 2, which is taking place once again in 1994, I figured this would have to happen, but I do wish that we had once again spent more time in the 1666 world. It makes us not able to connect to it as much, and in effect not connect to Seraphir, which I feel like is a pretty huge problem since Seraphir is sort of the main character of this series, sort of the implied main character in some ways. So that is sort of a problem. But at the same time, I do enjoy what happens in 1994. I do like the way the plot resolves, and the twists and turns that happen are pretty interesting. I'll admit that some of them are a little predictable, but at the same time, the reveal of who the villain is actually pretty interesting, and I think it does a good job of upending a certain horror trope that I found a little eye-roll worthy in 1994, but now they've actually sort of connected that trope to part 3, and I think it makes the character a lot more interesting when they upend who this character really is. And the action of the ending of this movie is a lot of fun as they're trying to take down all these serial killers. That was sort of an inevitability since all these movies have featured killers in one way or another. And I think the movie ends off in a pretty satisfying way. Not everything is perfect here, not everything works to an absolute T, but I did enjoy part 3 still more than part 1, so I am going to give this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars. So, as you can tell, I've been sort of trying to balance out each of these reviews between the negative and the positive, because I've seen a lot of people really praising these movies, and while I don't think the praise is unwarranted, I do think these movies are being overrated slightly. I feel like they're a lot more stylistic than they are substance, and for that reason, I don't love them as much as other people. However, that cannot be said for 1978 necessarily, which I will rank as my favorite of the series. I think this one actually does a really good job at attributing to its time period, and I think the characters are interesting. I think this one works really well as a standalone movie. This is the best of the series by a long shot, in my opinion, and I think it works really well on its own. I really would like Leigh Janiak to do more movies in this style. I think she has a really good knack for it. In second place, we will have the movie 1666. Now, I do feel like this one is pretty close in quality to 1994, which is in third place. Like 1666 is a really light 3.5 out of 5 for me, whereas 1994 would be a strong 3, so they are pretty close in quality to me. But I did like 1666 a little better because of the interesting first half and how quickly the plot was moving, and I really did enjoy in 1666 how they wrapped everything up. Whereas in 1994, which I will rank in last place, I do think this one had the biggest problem of having some not very compelling characters, not horrible characters once again, but it felt like most of them except for Sam were sort of cliches, and I didn't think the movie really picked up or was super interesting until the ending half, which is admittedly really good, and I do think saves this movie from being mediocre. So yeah, there we have it. There's my thoughts on the 3 Fear Street movies. What were your thoughts on the movies? Let me know in the comments down below. Once again, my name is James, and I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. I'll have some very exciting music and movies to talk about very soon. There's a lot of exciting stuff coming out, so I can't wait to have more episodes of the Critical Corner on the way, as well as probably some individual music and movie reviews, since there's a lot of big products coming out soon. But until then, I will see you on the next video.